extra credit, extra credit, extra credit, extra credit.
Hello and welcome to Live Priest or Die Extra Credit. I'm your co-host Mondo. In this series, we'll be conducting interviews to help our listeners understand some of our interests a little better. One of those interests is indie hip-hop artist Vyce Vursa out of Monroe, Michigan. In this interview, we talk about his album Identity Crisis, what influenced Vyce Vursa, and where Vyce Vursa is headed in the future. We hope you enjoy this, and we'll see you at our next scheduled podcast. Enjoy the listen. We have a guest. You may have heard him, may have seen the posts that we've been putting on our page. Vyce Vursa is here with us in the studio today.
How you doing?
I heard the new album that was dropped. I like it. I see there's a lot of growth there from some of the other things some of the other music that you put out before. Lyrically and production-wise, 15 tracks. That's pretty hefty album.
It started at 16, but I ended up cutting off one of the tracks.
From the other EPs that I've heard, I mean, those have been shorter. They haven't been quite as long. This one seemed like you put a lot of work into the structure behind it. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the album and where you got started with that?
The album's called Identity Crisis. I dropped it February 1st of this year. Initially, the concept behind it, I ran with this concept. I want to say it was 2011. I started doing this yin yang concept, and it was light and dark. Just kind of if you know anything about the yin yang and the Taoism behind it, what it stands for, and that I kind of was running off of that as my structure initially, but I found that about halfway through doing the album, it started getting in the way. It actually made me feel like I was kind of stifled on what I could do on the album. So I ended up kind of pulling away from that structure a little bit, and it ended up being called Identity Crisis, just due to the schizophrenic nature of the of the CD. It's kind of all over the place.
Yeah, I noticed there are quite a few tracks that touch on different things. First half of the album really seems kind of hard, kind of go get 'em. This is that style that we've seen from you before. It's really, really gritty there in the beginning, especially once you come out of the outro into Warning Shots.
Blessed with a Curse, yeah.
I mean, that I've been banging that in my car since I put it on CD. I mean, that's a really hot track. I like that one a lot.
I enjoyed making that track a lot. The feature was kind of an afterthought, but it's definitely one of the more gritty tracks on there.
As we progress through the album, like you said, it's kind of all over the place, but it fits the concept behind it. You get to later in the album, and you've got some of a different side of Vyce Vursa there. Because I'm used to seeing that, I'm gonna come at you, I'm gonna put my balls in your face, I'm gonna punch you in the face, that kind of gritty, go get 'em attitude. And then later, you start kind of rounding it out, talking more about the relationships that you have with not only your son, but then with a girlfriend.
Yeah, it starts to change gears. I would say really at Let Me Breathe was kind of like where the album switched sound wise, but as far as content goes, I would say it really switches with I'm Sorry, which initially I wrote that song. I actually wrote that song before me and my current girlfriend got back together. We dated back in like 2009, and then we lost touch for quite some time, and she just kind of popped back up, looked me up one day, and got a hold of me, and it was kind of like, whoa, because it was literally, I want to say 2 weeks after I wrote that song, and the song I'm Sorry actually deals with a few different relationships, but she was like a big part of the concept behind that song. So to have her just kind of pop back up, be like, hey, it was like a shock to the system. But I'm Sorry is about her rekindle the fire, same thing. Strange Love, we had went through a little break back back last year, and that Strange Love was about that. And then there's Why Should I Care was about next, but that song was actually immensely fun to make. Why Should I Care? It's got like a really, really different sound to a really bouncy kind of just fun sound for it being a breakup track. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. I noticed. I kind of caught myself bobbing a couple times when I was listening to lyrics. I was like, wait a minute, you really shouldn't be feeling this way when you listen to that kind of song.
It's kind of weird. It's like you don't want to cry in your beer. It's kind of like you want to like laugh at the situation. Like I'm free. I guess that's kind of like that was the attitude behind it. So I'm glad it came across that way, because that's definitely what I was trying to put forth.
This goes into how rounded the album is, and again, it just kind of reflects your growth as an artist. I mean, it kind of, you go from listening to Blessed with the Curse and then Dust Had Me Rolling, like
Listen, do that, yeah. But then you have tracks like that, and then you roll into Rekindle the Fire, and then Strange Love. Now I'm looking at some of these featured artists here. Out of all that you work with, who's one of your favorites to work with?
Man, that's a really hard call. A few of the guys that are on the features, Don Marvel, Cruel, K Rain Supreme. Sorry, he changed his name to K Rain Supreme. Those are guys that I've worked with in the past, just pretty consistently over the last, I would say, at least over the last 5 years, maybe even longer than that, maybe 8. Live Sosa, he was cool to work with. It was the first time working with him. I've been a fan of his music for a few years. I got I'm not gonna say what kind of deal, but I got a really good deal on the features for his choruses for I'm sorry and Rekindle the Fire. The one I most enjoyed working with, probably because it was here in my home studio, was Virtue, the guy that you hear on the hook for Hustle and Why Should I Care and Strange Love. I want to say there's one more. Wish It Would Rain. He was on the hook. He's actually a pastor. It was kind of weird how we came about working together. I mean, we met on a online radio show that I'd done before, and then he come up with, I can sing a little bit, and I was like, yeah, I don't know. And then he came out here and he did his thing, and I was just kind of blown away. So it was like, from that point, I mean, we have a really good friendship and a really good working relationship as well.
Yeah, it kind of shows. I see he's on a few of these tracks, and those are some of the ones that I remember that kind of stand out on the album. That's good that he had that opportunity for you there. So why don't
Yeah,
you give us a little bit of background about Vice Versa? Where did all this come from, and what inspired you to do this?
well, I've always been into hip hop. As first, I want to say the first CD I ever had was Chris Cross's album "The Bomb," way back in like '96. It was like right when CDs came out or something like that. Yeah, man. I mean, I really liked hip hop back then. I wasn't really into doing it. I started writing poetry, I want to say probably in middle school, maybe a little before middle school. I began writing poetry, and I kind of like the just writing, jotting down my thoughts on paper and my feelings on paper, and then it kind of led into this more structured thing to where I wound up being published in a poetry book. I can't remember what it was for life. Man, I'm terrible with them things. I probably should have it together for a resume or something, but I was published in a poetry book. I kind of started getting into writing it in rhyme form, and I first decided to give it a shot. My mom had dated this dude when I was I want to say 12 years old. He was a local rapper out in Detroit. He was an acid rapper,
Okay.
and he did a show one night. He went and opened up for D12 out here. He had come to the house after that, and he was Native American, so he used to go out in like his full war paint and feathers in his hair and all kinds of. But he come painted up with his feathers in his hair and shit, and he did this freestyle in the living room. He asked me if I had any instrumental tracks, and I happened to have Bone Thugs and Harmony single "If I Could Teach the World," and it had Body Rot, and actually it had the instrumental for Body Rot on there, and I threw it on, and this dude freestyled like throughout the whole thing. So I was kind of, it kind of drew me right in, man, to see somebody just do that right there in your living room in front of you. At 12, it left an impression on me. So I want to say about 14 years old, I started like really writing. 16 and 17, I used to ride around with my buddy. We used to ride around and freestyle the instrumentals. And then I really started like getting into putting songs together and stuff when I was about 19. I put together my first album, and it was freaking garbage, but I put together my first album, and I kind of went from there. And just over the years, just trying to build up my craft and get better at it, and really really learn the formulas behind putting together a decent album. And after, I want to say, I put out one, two, three or four mixtapes, which brought me to putting together Identity Crisis. I mean, that brings us to here. As far as what really got me into it, I would say the starting point all started with watching dude freestyle in my living room in front of me. I mean, that's a crazy experience at 12, when you never, the only thing you have is for reference is listening to these other rappers and stuff. You don't really,
Right.
back then you didn't really see it like that. I mean, everybody's a rapper now, but back then it was it was different. You didn't have too many people out there doing it. So to have a guy that was, out there pursuing something, just come and do that stuff. And he was really talented too. So, it just kind of blew my mind and drug me right into the culture and into the actual art behind it.
Watching the industry or the genre evolve I've always been kind of fascinated with that. You look at some of these who they themselves call themselves rappers turn into artists. It has always been a good thing, but it's far and few between now. You get more industry garbage out there now than you really do true artists. Making good songs that keep you entertained. So people telling stories, putting their art out there. It's fun to kind of watch that from a fan's perspective, to sit back and kind of see how things change. But that's something we'll get into later. But it sounds like you left a good impression on you there. Especially Detroit seems to be a place where a lot of hip hop artists come out of, and there seems to be a diverse culture there. Like you've mentioned, who's an acid rapper. Man, I haven't heard somebody talk about acid rap in I don't know how long.
It's been a long time.
Oh yeah, I remember that it was kind of big in here in Indianapolis, but it kind of died off. This isn't really a good there isn't really a good hip hop scene here, in my opinion. So he inspired you to start creating your own art. Where do you think Vyce Vursa is headed?
Man, that's a really good question, to be honest with you. I've spent long nights, long sleepless nights on that question, actually. It's hard for me to say. With as eclectic and as crazy as the album scenes, that's kind of my thought process, man. And it's kind of a roller coaster ride for me, because sitting around and wondering what's next, where do I go next? I can put all the plans together that I want to, but it's all about execution. And I think that really just kind of depends on the opportunities that either are presented to me or that I open up for myself, because I'm kind of in a transition period and trying to decide what's next. Where do I go next? As far as my art goes, I don't see me doing any backsliding. I don't see me, going to something that I'm not. I've never been a writer that writes about something that he isn't. So, I know for me, it's going to continue to be write my life and find a good beat to put it over. But I hope honestly I continue to improve and evolve the way that I have, because I'm really pleased with the direction that that I've ended up taking. And a lot of that's kind of up to the art. I don't really try to force it in one way or the other. I just kind of go with my gut. And I mean, it's hard to lay out plans when you're flying by the seat of your pants like that.
What we're hearing now, you're headed in a direction, but your possibilities are very open at the moment.
I'm not somebody that's majorly established, but I have my small following, and I appreciate every one of them. Trying to figure out how I want to build that following and what direction I want to go in. That's kind of where I'm at, because with the way my music is, with the fact that I do face paint and I don't do face paint, everything's kind of, I just sway with whatever way I'm feeling. And so it's really about figuring out what direction I want to go right now. With Identity Crisis, that's a very personal album, and putting everything out there like that, I'm kind of trying to see how people react to it, and maybe decide which way to go. I'm a very analytical guy. I know a lot of guys are on to the next, and I used to be one of those rappers, one of those artists that would go on to the next. But I've found very recently that it's pretty important to gauge the reaction to what you're putting out, and decide how to proceed based on that. I mean, when you're talking about where am I going next, that there's a plethora of answers there, because are we talking as an artist? Are we talking as a businessman? Are we talking as a manager? Because I manage my own stuff.
Right.
So, there's a lot. I think a lot of people underestimate the amount of work that has to be done in this industry. And that makes where am I going next a really hard question for me, because there's about 5 different ways I have to look at this album release.
Right. You finish your own production. You have to worry about album sales, merch. You have many hats you got to wear when you look at handling Vyce Vursa. You do. It is kind of an open question. As far as production, do you see yourself? Because like I had said before, the production quality of this is, I think, really good. Some of those beats are crisp. You can really kind of see the work that's been put into it. Do you prefer the production side more than the
Well,
writing?
the beats for the album, they were all ones that I either purchased or leased or whatever. But there's a theme there too. I mean, if you're listening to it, I mean, you can see where I prefer, the harder hitting, like trap sounding beats, or something that sounds a little more West Coast. Even some of the more mainstream R&B mix type beats, like Rekindle the Fire, or I'm Sorry, and Why Should I Care. Like, I have a very distinct sound that I look for and I like. And unfortunately, as a producer, because I started out, I probably should have thrown this out there earlier, but I did start out making my own beats. My first two albums were on beats that I had made. I spent more money on the artist side of it than I did on the production side. So now some of the sounds I'm working with, or most of the sounds that I'm working with, are kind of out of date, and they don't sound as crisp, as clean as the beats that you can find all over the internet. I mean, you've got all these guys that are pouring God knows what money into producing their own beats or making their own albums and all that, and it really makes keeping up with that industry really an impossibility unless you're well off, or making good money off of what you're doing. And I swayed more towards being a rapper and improving that craft rather than the production side. Now, I do like to sit down and make beats every once in a while, but ultimately they don't end up getting used just because of, like what I was saying, with the sound of the sounds that I have being out of date, or sounding out of date anyway, and working with this different software that these other guys are not using, and I really don't know the standard on that anymore.
Yeah, that's always a murky thing, because what you think is, hey, this is cost effective and it works, versus what everyone else is using that you have to pay, big bucks for to get, and then to utilize, plus the instruments that you'll have to use on top of that that can communicate with each other. I know a lot of things are virtual now, but there's still some hardware out there that will help you, especially if show dates and things like that. You're going to need something. You can't just use your laptop all the time.
Absolutely, and I think on the other end of production, as far as engineering my vocals and in that, I mean, I do all that myself. The mixing and the mastering tracks and things like that. It's a tedious process, but honestly, at the end of it, listening to it and how good everything sounds when I'm done with it, it's well worth the tedious process. I do enjoy the finished product. I would say mixing is probably the biggest pain in the ass in the world, but it's also the most rewarding, because if you do it right, you get these crisp, nice sounding songs, as opposed to clipping and popping and bass drop offs because it's hitting too hard, or all these interfering sounds and everything. It's a really in-depth process.
Yeah, that is hard as a independent artist to try to keep up with everything that's going on out there. Other people are using. Tell us a little bit about the indie scene in Detroit. What do you think has changed, and what do you think needs to be improved there?
you know I get this outsider point of view, being from Monroe, and Detroit is really, they're a really inclusive, exclusive type of situation. I don't know what word to use here, but if you're not from Detroit, you're not welcome. And that even extends to areas like Monroe, where I'm literally 20-25 minutes up the road. Their music scene is a lot like that. And I think if I was going to change anything, that would be the very first thing that I would start with, is that you get these people with this attitude, well, you ain't from Detroit, you ain't welcome in Detroit. And I think that's crazy. It's crazy to have that attitude, because you're then only influencing each other and not really keeping up with what's going on outside of Detroit. Like, Detroit's a great city. It's also a bomb of a city in certain ways, and I think it's really kind of poisonous to the art form itself to not look outside of your area. So if I were to start anywhere anyway with changing anything with the indie scene in Detroit, it would be to make it a little more inclusive to outside areas, because they're really not friendly to anybody that's not from Detroit. it's a big scene, and there's a lot of people involved in it. And you go to Detroit, and you've got these independent studios in Detroit that have thrived that wouldn't have thrived before if you didn't have so many rappers around. And you've got these management companies out there that were never there before, and you've got promotion companies. So I mean, in a way, the size of the scene has definitely improved the the economy in that industry. But at the same time, it's like anything else. If you start letting everyone in, then it becomes a jumbled mess of all different kinds of crap.
Right. It becomes saturated, and you don't have the
You
purity of
don't have
what
those.
it
You don't have standout artists. You know what I'm saying? There, you don't have these standout artists that you would have had before. Like, if the scene had been as big as it is now back in the '90s, like Eminem, he's a standout artist from Detroit. Proof was a standout artist from Detroit. You had Blade Icewood. You wouldn't have dudes that came out like that. Big Herc. You wouldn't have these guys that popped up on the scene and really wowed everybody if it had been so oversaturated back in the '90s. And Trick, that's another one. Royce the 5'9". I mean, you can go on for days about good artists from Detroit, but these are all guys that came out when I was younger, when I was a kid, and you don't have that now because of the oversaturation. So that's a big problem as well. But I think with so many artists being out there, there are a good number of talented artists in Detroit. There's a good number of different types of rappers out there. You've got the guys that like to tell stories. You got the real lyrical guys out there. You've got the more hyped up club oriented type of music out there too. The crunk music out in Detroit. I mean, you've got this good mixture of different types of rap, but it also becomes a problem or a thing because then you've got the different types of rap fighting with each other out there, and it's really and universally in the underground in the music industry and any the indie scene, whatever you want to call it, there's generally too much conflict going on. Nobody can see past wanting to be the superstar to work together to actually get somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, diversity is always good. You always want diversity, especially when it comes to music. I think it's always good to kind of have, even within certain subgenres of genres, it's okay to do that.
Yeah.
But after a while, yeah, all that infighting does is hinder the progress of the ultimate goal you're trying to achieve. I agree with that completely. I mean, if you can't get to where you're going to get to by not having an unhealthy competition, then you got to refocus as to what your goals are. It's not a bad thing to have competition, but it's not a good thing when that hinders your progress too.
Well, and it seems like, and this seems like just a wide industry issue altogether. It seems like the industry as a whole has got this problem where nobody recognizes the fact that there are subgenres within rap.
Yeah,
Like you've got every other form of music acknowledges that there's subgenres in that form of music. You got country's got like southern country rock and the ballads and the pop country. And you've got your R&B can go the way of neo and more um upbeat, maybe clubbier R&B like Chris Brown, whereas you go the other direction and have stuff like Mary J. Blige and the real smooth, just kind of Alicia Keys back when she was big. I mean, I'm not really up in the scene right now, but you've got just different subgenres and all these genres. But it seems like rap is the one place that nobody wants to recognize that they're subgenres. Like it's either I'm a fan of Young Thug and everybody else sucks, or I'm a fan of Tech Nine and everybody else sucks. Like there's no acknowledgement of the fact that there is crunk hip hop, that there is lyrical hip hop, that there is heartfelt hip hop, and then there's the mainstream hip hop. There's no acknowledgement that subgenres exist. It's just if I listen to this guy, everybody else sucks. And it's really hurting the industry.
I think that's something that's happened. I'd say just within the early 2000s. I mean, back when I was in high school and I was just kind of getting into what was considered like hardcore rap then. Um, I would listen to like South Central Cartel. That was a whole subgenre. They had other artists that were similar to them, but it wasn't. It was under hip hop. It was under rap, but then it was its own genre. It was. I'm not even sure what we would call that now. But then I would also listen to Ice Cube. I would also listen to Bone. I would listen to Eazy-E. I would listen to. There's so many other artists, but then
Right.
each of those, like Bone, was rap, but it was kind of R&B too.
Yeah.
They kind of fell in between these two different genres, and then I think it was okay to say, yeah, I listen to this genre of hip hop, but then as artists progressed and sounds changed and time went on, that kind of fell off. You bring up a good point about that. Like I think you lose certain things, and you said that yourself. With all these other genres, they have subgenres. I mean, you look at electronic music right now. You've got EDM, you've got techno, you've got trance, you've got Goa, you got progressive trance, hardcore. You have all these things, but then it's like you said. Now it's like, well, I only listen to trap music,
Yeah.
and that's great. Like you can do that, but you can't say that only trap artists are true core artists of hip hop. That's completely inaccurate. You cannot say that.
Well,
So
and I think the listeners, I think as a fan myself, I think we all acknowledge the fact that they're subgenres. I think the problem isn't so much within the fans, it's more the industry itself. It's like the industry now says what's mainstream is stuff like Young Thug and trap artists, and that's it. You know what I mean? They're not going to promote somebody like Locksmith or Logic who are rapping, as a lyrical form or telling stories, or that genre, that subgenre of hip hop, like the conscious stuff. You're not going to have certain record labels pushing the conscious stuff because 16-year-olds are buying trap music and Young Thug. I say Young Thug because I can't think of a genre to place him in. He's just kind of like this in between trap and R&B, and I don't even know.
Well, this concludes part one of our interview series, Extra Credit with Vyce Vursa. We'll be returning with part two soon, as well as our regularly scheduled podcast. We hope you enjoy the listen.
Extra credit, extra credit, extra credit, extra credit, extra credit.